Welcome to the ultimate disturbing video game Iceberg. I'll be going through each of the 70 entries on this list. If there's an individual layer of the iceberg you want to see, you can watch one of the individual videos I made, or you can skip to the timestamp. Apologies for the audio and video quality in tier 1, but every layer after that is perfect. I don't see a reason to waste any more time, so let's get into it. Layer 1. The Resident Evil series began in 1996, created by Capcom. At its core, it's a survival horror franchise that blends biological experiments, corporate greed, and outbreaks that turn people into monsters. Most of the chaos traces back to the Umbrella Corporation, whose bioweapons spiral completely out of control. Across the series, players step into quarantined cities, isolated villages, and decaying labs, fighting not just enemies, but fear itself. What makes Resident Evil so unsettling isn't just the gore, it's the atmosphere. The games thrive on limited resources, tight spaces, and a constant feeling that you're never truly safe. Enemies look almost human, which makes confronting them deeply uncomfortable. There's also strong body horror, mutilation, infection, and loss of control over one's own flesh are recurring themes. One of the big reasons I think it's disturbing and made the list is because the series taps into real-world fears. Pandemics, unethical science, corporations valuing profit over human life. You're not just fighting monsters, you're witnessing the consequences of humanity pushing too far. Released in 2014 and created by Scott Cawthon, Five Nights at Freddy's puts you in the role of a nighttime security guard at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, a rundown children's establishment filled with animatronic robots. Your job sounds easy: sit in an office, watch security cameras, and survive 5 nights. But the animatronics don't stay still, and if they reach you, it's game over. What I think makes FNAF so unsettling is what it doesn't show you. You're powerless, stuck in one room, unable to fight back. The horror comes from the anticipation, watching cameras, listening for footsteps, and waiting for something to move. Silence just becomes a terrifying noise. And then there's the setting. Animatronics are meant to entertain children, but here they are, lifeless, uncanny, hostile. The game also hints at a much darker story beneath the surface. Missing children, haunted machines, and unspeakable crimes. Without ever fully explaining it, your imagination fills in the gaps, making everything worse. Released in 2005 and developed by Monolith Productions, Fear blends fast-paced gunplay with supernatural horror. You play as a Special Forces operative, investigating a violent outbreak linked to a secret experiment. Very quickly, the mission spirals into something far more disturbing, centered around a mysterious little girl named Alma Wade. What makes Fear so unsettling is how it messes with your perception. One moment you're clearing rooms in intense firefights, then suddenly the game slows down. Hallways stretch endlessly, lights flicker. Alma appears without warning, often doing nothing at all. She doesn't attack. You just know she's there. The horror comes from the unpredictability. Scares aren't scripted around combat, they interrupt quiet moments, making you dread walking forward. The game also leans heavy into psychological trauma, human experimentation, and abuse, turning its story into something deeply uncomfortable rather than just scary. Originally released in 1995 by Human Entertainment, Clock Tower is a point-and-click survival horror game inspired by classic slasher films. You play as a young orphan named Jennifer, exploring a massive isolated mansion after being adopted. only to discover you're being hunted. Unlike most horror games, you can't fight back. All you can do is run, hide, and survive. Your pursuer is the infamous Scissor Man, a small, seemingly human figure armed with an oversized pair of scissors. What makes Clock Tower so unsettling is its helplessness. There are no weapons, no combat systems, just panic. When Scissor Man appears, a sharp musical cue plays, and your heart immediately sinks. You never know when he'll show up or from where. The game also leans heavily into vulnerability and realism. You play as an ordinary person, not a hero, trapped in quiet hallways and locked rooms. Pixel art, eerie sound design, and long stretches of silence build constant dread. And because the story unfolds differently depending on your actions, no playthrough ever feels completely safe. Released in 2018 and created by indie developer Mistman 12, Baldi's Basics is presented as a low-quality 90s style learning game. You're tasked with collecting notebooks inside a strange school while answering basic math questions. But once you get one answer wrong, the game completely changes. Baldi, the smiling stick figure teacher, becomes aggressive, and your simple school turns into a maze of panic. What makes Baldi's Basics unsettling is the contrast. The bright colours, cheap textures, and cheerish music clash hard with the fear you start to feel. The game intentionally looks broken and uncanny, tapping into nostalgia while twisting it into something wrong. Baldi himself is terrifying not because of how he looks, but because of how he behaves. He hears everything. Every mistake makes him faster. The sound of his ruler slapping the floor grows louder as he gets closer, breathing pure dread. There is no real story, no explanation, and that lack of context makes the experience feel like a corrupted memory or a nightmare version of a childhood. Released in 1999 by Konami, Silent Hill follows Harry Mason as he searches for his missing adopted daughter in a fog-covered town. Unlike traditional horror games focused on action, Silent Hill emphasizes exploration, isolation, and atmosphere. The town itself feels alive. Empty streets, blaring sirens, and a constant sense that something is deeply wrong. What makes Silent Hill so unsettling is ambiguity. The game rarely explains what's going on or why. Thick fog limits your vision, forcing you to listen instead of look. The radio crackles with static when enemies are nearby, creating an anxiety even before you see anything. The monsters aren't random. They're grotesque, symbolic, and deeply personal, hinting at trauma, guilt, and depression. Combined with its industrial sound design and sudden shifts into Nightmare World, the game feels less like a story you're playing and more like a psychological breakdown you're trapped inside. Released in 2005 and developed by Monolith Productions, Condemned puts you in the role of an FBI agent hunting a serial killer through decaying, abandoned urban spaces. Instead of zombies or demons, you face deranged criminals and unstable people in condemned buildings, subway tunnels, and empty department stores. Combat is up close and brutal, often relying on whatever blunt object you can find. What makes Condemned so unsettling is how grounded it feels. The enemies aren't supernatural, they're human, unpredictable, and violent. Fights are messy and desperate, forcing you into uncomfortable proximity. You hear enemies muttering to themselves in the dark, sometimes before you even see them. The environments are filthy, claustrophobic, and oppressive. game's constantly messing with your sanity, blurring the line between reality and hallucination. There's no power fantasy here, just tension, fear, and the feeling that everything is slowly falling apart. Released in 2010 by Frictional Games, Amnesia follows Daniel, a man who wakes up in a dark, crumbling castle with no memory of who he is or why he's there. There are no weapons. Your only goal is to explore, hide, and survive while piecing together fragments. What makes Amnesia so terrifying is helplessness. You can't fight back, you can only run or hide. Staying in darkness restores your cover, but drains your sanity, causing hallucinations and distorted sounds. Light keeps you sane, but also makes you visible. The monsters are rarely shown clearly, forcing your imagination to do the work. I think this works well due to the graphical limitations of the time. The game leans heavily into themes of guilt, memory, and self-inflicted horror, making the fear feel deeply personal rather than just external. Corpse Party began as a Japanese indie game and gained popularity with its 2010 remake, developed by Team Gris Gris. The story follows a group of high school students who perform a harmless-looking friendship ritual, only to be transported to Heavenly Host Elementary, a nightmarish abandoned school trapped between dimensions. Separated and hunted, the characters must find a way to survive, if they can. What makes Corpse Party so horrifying is contrast. The game uses cute anime-style sprites and simple visuals to tell a story filled with extreme violence, torture, and death, often involving children. Many of these moments aren't shown directly, but are described in graphic detail through sound and design text. Released in 1999 and developed by Acclaim Studios' T-Side, Shadow Man is based on the Valiant Comics character of the same name. You play as Michael Leroy, a man caught between the world of the living and the dead, tasked with stopping a group of serial killers from unleashing an apocalypse. The game blends exploration, combat, and puzzle solving across nightmarish environments, inspired by voodoo mythology and occult horror. What makes Shadow Man so disturbing is its tone.
Nettie sent me to look for these Govi that supposedly contain the Dark Souls. Well, I've not even come close to one.
The game is steeped in death imagery, graveyards, execution sites, and decaying dreamscapes that feel hostile and wrong. Its soundtrack is low, ambient, and oppressive, making even empty areas feel threatening. The villains are especially unsettling. Instead of monsters, you face twisted representations of real-world evil. Serial killers whose stories are implied through disturbing visuals and environments. The game rarely relies on jump scares. Instead, it builds up dread through isolation, symbolism, and the constant presence of death. Layer 2. Stalker. Stalker is a series of survival horror shooters developed by GSC Game World. The first game, Stalker: Shadow of Chernobyl, released in 2007 and takes place inside a fictional version of the Chernobyl exclusion zone in Ukraine. The world of the game draws inspiration from the real-life Chernobyl disaster in 1986, but mixes it with science fiction, paranormal anomalies, and mutated creatures. In the game's story, a second mysterious explosion at the power plant creates a dangerous region known simply as the Zone. Inside it, the laws of physics break down. Invisible anomalies can tear you apart instantly. Strange artifacts form with supernatural properties, and hostile mutants roam the ruins. People known as stalkers illegally enter the zone to hunt these artifacts, chasing fortune despite the constant risk of death. What makes Stalker so disturbing isn't just the monsters, it's the atmosphere. The zone feels abandoned, hostile, and deeply wrong. You spend long stretches alone in silent forests, empty villages, and decaying Soviet structures, where something always feels like it's watching you. The game rarely relies on jump scares. Instead, it builds dread through isolation, unpredictable dangers, and the unsettling sense that the environment itself is alive and completely indifferent to whether you survive. And that lingering feeling is what makes the zone so unforgettable. Cry of Fear. Cry of Fear is a psychological horror game originally started as a mod for Half-Life before being released as a standalone game in 2013. Despite being made by a small independent team, it quickly gained a reputation for being one of the most unsettling horror experiences on PC. The game follows a young man named Simon Henriksson who wakes up alone in a dark, empty city after being hit by a car. Armed with little more than a phone, flashlight and handgun, he wanders through the abandoned streets, apartments and underground tunnels while being hunted by a grotesque, distorted creature. What makes Cry of Fear so disturbing isn't just the monsters, it's the psychological themes behind them. As the story unfolds, the game explores depression, trauma, loneliness, and suicidal thoughts, with many of the enemies representing twisted manifestations of Simon's mental state. The game constantly puts players in vulnerable situations, tight corridors, limited ammunition, and enemies that move in unnatural, jerky ways. Combined with its oppressive darkness and haunting sound design, it creates an atmosphere that feels intensely personal and deeply uncomfortable. Instead of just trying to scare you, Cry of Fear forces you to sit with the character's psychological breakdown, and that's what makes it so disturbing long after you stop playing. Dark Deception. Now, for this entry I wasn't sure, as on the Iceberg it just said Deception. I was looking into it, I couldn't find any games specifically named Deception, so I just went with this one here because it seems to fit the theme. Okay, so Dark Deception is a horror maze game developed by Glowstick Entertainment and first released in 2018. The game mixes arcade-style gameplay with horror elements, often described as something like Pac-Man, but twisted into a nightmare. You play as a man named Doug Hauser, who finds himself trapped in a mysterious realm controlled by a sinister woman named Bierce. She forces you to enter different nightmare worlds and collect glowing soul shards while being hunted by increasingly terrifying enemies. At first glance, the game almost feels colourful and arcade-like, but that's part of what makes it disturbing. Each level hides something darker beneath the surface, whether it's murderous mascots, living statues, or warped hospital patients. The enemies feel exaggerated and grotesque in a way that turns familiar settings into something deeply uncomfortable. The game also rarely lets you fight back. Most of the time you're running, trapped in a tight maze-like environments, while something relentlessly chases you. The constant pressure combined with loud audio cues and sudden encounters creates a sense of panic that doesn't really let up. The mix of bright visuals, psychological manipulation, and non-stop pursuit is what gives Dark Deception its unsettling edge. Miseo. Miseo is a horror adventure game created by Japanese developer Sen and originally released in 2011 using RPG Maker. Like many RPG Maker horror titles, it relies on less complex graphics and more on storytelling, atmosphere, and psychological tension. The story follows a high school student who suddenly finds her school transformed into a nightmare world. The chaos begins after the mysterious disappearance of a girl named Miseo Setomi. Rumors spread that her vengeful spirit has returned, and the school itself begins to collapse into a twisted version of reality. To escape, the player has to uncover what really happened to Miseo by exploring the ruined school and finding pieces of her body that have been scattered throughout the building. What makes Miseo so disturbing isn't just the supernatural horror, it's the themes behind it. As the story unfolds, it reveals dark topics like bullying, cruelty, and the consequences of ignoring someone who is suffering. Many of the scenes are shockingly graphic for such a simple looking game, using sudden gore and disturbing imagery to leave a strong impression. Siren, also known as Forbidden Siren in some regions, is a survival horror game developed by Japan Studio and published by Sony Computer Entertainment for the PlayStation 2 in 2003. The game was directed by Kiichiro Toyama, who previously worked on the original Silent Hill. The story takes place in a remote Japanese village called Hanuda, where a mysterious siren echoes through the night and traps the town in supernatural disaster. The player controls multiple characters across different points in time, all trying to survive while uncovering the truth behind the village and the strange creatures known as Shibito. What makes Siren so disturbing is its atmosphere and realism. The Shibito aren't typical monsters. They're former villagers who continued their normal routines while being twisted into something unnatural. You might see them patrolling with flashlights, praying at shrines, or muttering to themselves while searching for you. The game also forces you to hide rather than fight. With limited weapons and slow movement, survival often means watching enemies through the game's sight-jacking mechanic, literally seeing through the eyes of the creatures hunting you. The constant feeling of being watched, combined with the eerie silence, distorted voices, and the unsettling behaviour of the Shibito, makes Siren one of the most psychologically disturbing horror games ever made. Yume Nikki. Yume Nikki is an indie exploration game created by the mysterious Japanese developer known only as Kikiyama. Released in 2004 using RPG Maker, the game quickly gained a cult following online because of its strange, dreamlike world and lack of traditional storytelling. You play as a quiet girl named Madotsuki who refuses to leave her apartment. Instead, she goes to sleep and enters a series of bizarre dream worlds that the player can freely explore. There is no combat, almost no dialogue, and very little explanation of what's actually happening. What makes Yume Nikki so disturbing is how surreal and unpredictable the dream environments are. As you wander through these strange landscapes, you'll encounter unsettling characters, distorted creatures, and imagery that feels symbolic but never fully explained. Some areas feel lonely and quiet, while others suddenly become deeply uncomfortable, featuring grotesque visuals, eerie music, and characters that behave in ways that feel completely unnatural. Because the game never tells you what anything means, players are left to interpret it themselves. Many people believe the dreams represent themes like isolation, anxiety, and psychological trauma. That ambiguity is what made Yume Nikki so unsettling. It doesn't try to scare you directly. It creates a world that feels wrong in ways you can't fully explain. Simulacra. Simulacra is a found phone horror game developed by Kagan Games and released in 2017. The entire game takes place on a smartphone that the player discovers, belonging to a missing woman named Anna Wright. Instead of exploring a traditional game world, you investigate Anna's disappearance by digging through her phone, reading text messages, watching recorded videos, checking emails, and scrolling through social media. Piece by piece, you start to uncover what happened to her before she vanished. What makes Simulacra so disturbing is how realistic it feels. The game uses live-action video clips of Anna that slowly become more frantic and unsettling as the story progresses. Her messages grow increasingly desperate, hinting that something inside the phone itself might be influencing her. There is also a strange digital entity known as a simulacra, something that mimics people online and spreads through phones and social media. Because the entire experience takes place inside a device we use every day, the horror feels uncomfortably close to reality. Instead of distant monsters or haunted locations, the threat exists inside something as ordinary as a smartphone. Manhunt. Manhunt is a stealth horror game developed by Rockstar North and published by Rockstar Games in 2003. The game puts players in control of a death row inmate named James Earl Cash, who is forced to participate in a series of brutal snuff films, orchestrated by a sadistic director named Lionel Starkweather. Cash is dropped into abandoned city environments and hunted by violent gangs, and the only way to survive is by stealthily executing enemies in increasingly brutal ways, using everyday objects like plastic bags, shards of glass, and baseball bats. What makes Manhunt so disturbing is not just the extreme levels of violence, it's the way the game presents it. Executions are drawn out and graphic, and the game actively rewards the player for performing more brutal kills. And the entire experience is framed like a film, with Starkweather watching and encouraging the violence through a camera. Critics and media outlets argued that its graphic content crossed a line, especially after it was briefly linked to a real-world murder case in the United Kingdom. As a result, Manhunt was banned in several countries, including New Zealand and Germany, and it was temporarily pulled from sale in the UK. Even today, Manhunt is still remembered as one of the most controversial and disturbing video games ever made. Eternal Darkness. Eternal Darkness is a psychological horror game developed by Silicon Knights and published by Nintendo for the Nintendo GameCube in 2002. Unlike most horror games that focus on a single character, the story spans centuries and allows multiple people across different time periods who become connected by an ancient, terrifying force. The main storyline centers around a woman named Alex Rovas, who investigates the mysterious death of her grandfather in a secluded mansion. As she uncovers the truth, she discovers an ancient book called the Tome of Eternal Darkness, which reveals a hidden history of dark gods and forbidden knowledge. What makes Eternal Darkness so disturbing is its famous sanity system. As its characters encounter monsters or supernatural events, their sanity slowly drains. When it gets low, the game begins to mess with the player in unexpected ways. You might see fake error messages, hear voices that aren't there, watch walls start bleeding, or even think your TV volume suddenly dropped to 0. Sometimes the game even pretends to delete your save file. By directly manipulating what the player sees and hears, Eternal Darkness breaks the fourth wall and makes you question what's real inside the game. Sanitarium. Sanitarium is a psychological horror adventure game developed by Dreamforge Entertainment and released in 1998. The game follows a man named Max Lafton who wakes up in an asylum after a car accident with no memory of who he is or how he got there. As Max tries to piece together his identity, he travels through a series of bizarre and surreal environments that seem to represent fragments of his past. Each chapter places him in strange locations, like a town filled with deformed children, a village obsessed with ancient rituals, or a twisted carnival-like world. What makes Sanitarium so disturbing is how heavily it leans into psychological horror rather than traditional scares. The environments feel dreamlike and symbolic, often reflecting trauma, grief, and guilt buried in Max's memories. Many of the characters you encounter are unsettling in subtle ways, whether it's their distorted appearance, cryptic dialogue, or the uncomfortable themes surrounding illness, death, and loss. Instead of relying on monsters or jump scares, the game creates a constant feeling that something is deeply wrong with the world you're exploring. And as Max's memories slowly return, the truth behind the story becomes even more unsettling than the strange places he travels through. Postal. Postal is a top-down shooter released in 1997 by Running with Scissors. Unlike most games at the time, Postal didn't focus on heroism or saving the world. Instead, it put players in control of an unarmed man, often referred to as Postal Dude, who goes on a violent rampage through a suburban town. There's very little traditional story. The game presents itself through disturbing diary entries that suggest the protagonist is mentally unstable, paranoid, and detached from reality. Civilians aren't enemies, they're just people going about their lives, and the player is the threat. What makes Postal so disturbing to me is the tone of the game. It's bleak, nihilistic, and intentionally uncomfortable. There's no justification for what you're doing, no moral framing, just escalating chaos presented in cold manner. The visuals are dark and gritty, the soundtrack is ominous, and the game constantly reinforces the idea that you're playing as someone completely unhinged. Because of this, Postal sparked heavy controversy. It was banned or restricted in several countries, including Germany and New Zealand, similar to Manhunt. It was also widely criticised for its glorification of senseless violence. Postal isn't disturbing because it tries to scare you. It's disturbing because of what you can do. The Suffering. The Suffering is a psychological horror action game developed by Surreal Software and released in 2004 by Midway Games for the PlayStation 2, Xbox, and PC. The game follows a prisoner named Torque, who has been sentenced to death and sent to a prison located on a remote island. Shortly after he arrives, the prison is overrun by terrifying creatures, and the entire island descends into chaos. As Torque tries to survive and escape, he begins to experience disturbing visions that hint at a violent past he can't fully remember. What makes the suffering so unsettling is the way it blends supernatural horror with themes of guilt, punishment, and morality. Many of the monsters in the game are designed around different methods of execution, twisted figures with blades, restraints, or machinery built into their bodies. These creatures symbolize the brutal history of the prison and the suffering of people who died there. Throughout the game, the player also makes moral choices that affects Torque's personality and the ending of the story. Depending on how you play, Torque may be portrayed as either a victim or a truly monstrous person. That uncertainty about who Torque really is and what he may have done is what gives the suffering its disturbing psychological edge. Layer 3. Echo Night. Released in 1998 and developed by From Software, Echo Night is a slow, atmospheric horror adventure for the original PlayStation. You play as Richard Osmond, who wakes up alone aboard a seemingly abandoned ocean liner with no memory of how he got there. There's no combat, no weapons, and no traditional enemies, just empty corridors, locked doors, and the lingering presence of the dead. What makes Echo Night so disturbing is how quietly it unsettles you. The game traps you in total isolation, surrounding you with silence broken only by creaking metal, distant footsteps, and whispers that feel just out of reach. The ghosts that you encounter aren't hostile, they're tragic. They replay fragments of their final moments, trapped in loops of regret, fear, and confusion, and you're forced to witness their suffering rather than fight it. Without combat, you feel completely vulnerable, wandering dim hallways, guided only by flickering lights and journal entries. Never sure if you're alone or being watched. The horror doesn't come from the jump scares, it comes from the atmosphere, helplessness, and the realization that these spirits don't want revenge. They just want peace. Harvester. Before I explain what this is, I'm going to show you a clip. Viewer discretion is advised, because this is very gory and fucking creepy. It's just fucking weird.
What's wrong with her? My goodness. Oh, it's not as bad as it looks. You just pop them back in.
Yeah. Harvester is a brutal point-and-click adventure from Digifix Interactive that mixes horror, satire, and grotesque storytelling into one strange package. You play as Steve Mason, an 18-year-old who wakes up in an ideal-looking 1950s town of Harvest with no memory of who he is. Everyone claims to know him, but nothing feels right. As the week unfolds, Steve is pressured by a mysterious cult-like group called the Order of the Harvest Moon to complete a series of tasks. Tasks that quickly take a violent turn into horror. What makes Harvester so disturbing is how it blends surreal satire with extreme graphic content. The game plays like a nightmare version of Small Town America, where every day hides grotesque secrets, missing loved ones, cult rivals, and gruesome discoveries like mutilated bodies and bizarre deaths. Citizens you meet are eccentric, creepy, and often hostile, making you question whether this town ever had a moral compass to begin with. On top of the unsettling story, Harvester doesn't shy away from mature themes. Disturbing scenes involving violence, sexual content, and body horror pop up throughout the story. The game is so controversial, it was even banned in some countries for its provocative imagery. At its core, Harvester delivers an experience that's equal parts unsettling satire and disturbing horror, forcing players not just to survive, but to grapple with the eerie reflection of violence and morality that lurks beneath its bizarre surface. Haunting Ground. Haunting Ground is a survival horror game released in 2005 for the PlayStation 2, developed by Capcom. It's often seen as a spiritual successor to Clock Tower. We covered that in part 1. Originally released in 1995 by Human Entertainment, you can see the quality has improved a lot from part 1. Anyways, the game follows Fiona Belly, a young woman who wakes up alone in a mysterious castle with no memory of how she got there. With no real weapons, her only ally is a dog named Huey, who helps her survive and escape. What makes Hunting Ground so disturbing is how helpless it makes you feel. You're constantly being stalked by enemies you can't truly fight, forcing you to run, hide, and panic. The game's fear system causes Fiona to stumble and lose control when terrified, putting you directly inside her vulnerability. Combined with predatory enemies, unsettling themes, and claustrophobic environments, Hunting Ground creates a constant feeling of being watched and hunted, long after you put the controller down. Bad Mojo. Bad Mojo is one of the strangest and most unsettling games of the 1990s. Released in 1996 and developed by Pulse Entertainment, it's an adventure game where you don't play as a hero, you play as a cockroach. After a scientist named Roger Sams is transformed into one, you're forced to survive inside a decaying apartment building from the perspective of an insect. What makes Bad Mojo so disturbing is how effectively it turns that perspective against you. Everyday spaces become massive, filthy labyrinths filled with hazards, parasites, and grime. You crawl through kitchens, drains, and hidden spaces where danger feels constant. And the sound design, wet, scuttling, dripping water, and unsettling music, makes everything feel oppressive. There's no real combat, it's just survival, which reinforces how small and vulnerable you are. By forcing you to exist as something people instinctively fear or disgust, Bad Mojo creates kind of a horror that's psychological rather than violent. And that uncomfortable feeling sticks with you long after it ends. Detention. Detention is a 2D horror adventure developed by Red Candle Games and released in 2017. At first glance, it might seem like a simple side-scrolling horror game, but it's far deeper and darker than that. The story is set in a Taiwanese high school during the 1960s under martial law, a real historical period known as the White Terror, when political oppression and fear were a part of everyday life. The game begins with two students trapped inside their school during a typhoon, only to discover the building has shifted into an eerie, ghost-filled version of itself. As you explore, supernatural forces and nightmarish creatures known as the Lingered hunt you. But the real terror isn't just the monsters, it's what they represent. The school becomes a vessel for psychological horror, blending Taiwanese cultural elements, Taoist and Buddhist symbolism and grotesque imagery with the weight of historical trauma. What makes Detention truly disturbing isn't just the jump scares or haunting visuals, it's the oppressive atmosphere of dread and paranoia. The corridors feel claustrophobic and hostile, the ghosts often resemble distorted versions of the characters themselves, and there is a constant feeling of being watched or pursued through every room. There's no fighting back, just hiding, breathing softly, and confronting the darker truths that the school hides. Galerians. Galerians is a cult horror game released in 1999 for the original PlayStation. Developed by Polygon Magic, it blends survival horror with sci-fi and psychological themes. You play as Rian, a boy who wakes up in a mysterious medical facility with no memory of who he is, only to discover he has dangerous psychic powers and is connected to a group of altered humans known as the Galerians. What makes Galerians disturbing is its atmosphere and subject matter. The game leans heavily into body horror, mutilated enemies, and bleak laboratory environments, creating a constant feeling of unease. Its story explores identity, loss of control, and human experimentation, while unsettling visuals and sound design keep you on edge. Rather than relying on jump scares, Galerians unsettles you by slowly revealing how twisted its world and its creation of life truly is. Rule of Rose. Rule of Rose is a cult survival horror game released in 2006 for the PlayStation 2. You play as Jennifer, a young woman trapped in a strange 1930s mansion ruled by a group of children who enforce cruel rules and hierarchies. What makes Rule of Rose so disturbing is its psychological focus. Instead of constant action, the game leans into themes of childhood trauma, abuse, and distorted innocence. The children act as antagonists, turning familiar settings into hostile, unsettling spaces. Combined with the bleak atmosphere, minimal combat, and unsettling symbolism, the horror feels deeply emotional rather than just frightening. Rule of Rose isn't about monsters jumping out at you, to us slowly realizing how twisted and cruel this world truly is. Kudelka. Released in 1999 for the PlayStation 1, Kudelka is a dark, gothic horror game set in a haunted Welsh monastery. It's famous for being the secret prequel to the Shadow Heart series, but it feels much meaner and more realistic. The game is disturbing because it doesn't rely on cheap jump scares. Instead, it uses a suffocating heavy atmosphere. Most of the time there's no music at all, just the sound of your footsteps and the wet, gross noises of things moving in the dark. The monsters are the real stars of the nightmare. They aren't typical ghosts or zombies. They are twisted piles of flesh and limbs that look like they are in constant pain. Because the game uses motion capture for its characters, the human drama feels unusually grounded and cold. Kudelka is unsettling because it suggests that the humans who lived in the monastery were far more evil than the monsters they left behind. It's bleak, quiet, and a deeply uncomfortable experience. Lisa the First. Released in 2012, Lisa the First is a surreal psychological precursor to Lisa the Painful. It's an exploration-based horror game where you play as a young girl named Lisa, navigating the twisted nightmare of her own subconscious. The game is deeply disturbing because it's an unflinching look at child abuse. There's no traditional monsters. Instead, the world is filled with distorted, haunting versions of Lisa's father, Marty. His face is everywhere, on the walls, in the shadows, and constantly chasing you. It's unsettling because it uses heavy symbolism to represent sexual trauma and domestic violence. Every enemy and weird NPC is a physical manifestation of the ways her father violated her. There are no jump scares here. The horror comes from the total feeling of helplessness. No matter how far you run into this dream world, you always end up back in your room, being watched. It's a short, miserable experience that shows exactly how trauma can break a child's mind. Obscure. Released in 2004, Obscure is a survival cult classic that plays like a twisted R-rated teen slasher movie. Set in a rundown high school, it follows a group of students searching for a missing friend, only to find their campus overrun by biological experiments. What makes it so disturbing is the permadeath. If one of your characters dies, they are gone for good. The story doesn't stop. The remaining students have to mourn and keep moving. It creates a genuine sense of dread because no one is safe. The monsters add to the nightmare. They are pale, light-sensitive mutations that look like inside-out human bodies. Because they hide in the dark, you're constantly forced to use a flashlight just to see the gore. It's a bleak, gritty, and surprisingly mean-spirited game that turns a familiar school setting into a total slaughterhouse. Pathologic. Released in 2005, Pathologic is a psychological survival game from Russia that is often called a suffering simulator. You play as a doctor, arriving in a remote town just as a supernatural plague begins to wipe out the population. You have 12 days to find a cure, but the clock never stops and the town doesn't care if you succeed. The game is disturbing because it's so intentionally miserable. You aren't a hero, you are starving, an exhausted outsider in a world that feels like a fever dream. The horror comes from the hopelessness. As the plague spreads, food prices skyrocket, forcing you to choose between buying a piece of bread for yourself or a piece of medicine for a dying child. With eerie masked figures watching you from the shadows and a constant sense of decay, Pathologic doesn't rely on monsters. It's unsettling because it forces you to make impossible moral choices just to survive another hour. It is a bleak, draining masterpiece about being completely powerless against an invisible enemy.
School kids around here 3 days ago?
Illbleed.
They had special invites.
Released in 2001 for the Dreamcast, Illbleed is a bizarre satirical horror game that feels like a fever dream. You play as Eriko Christie, a cynical teenager who enters a deadly horror theme park to save her friends and win a $100 million cash prize. Each attraction is a twisted stage based off different movie tropes, from killer dolls to giant mutated snacks. What makes Illbleed so disturbing isn't just the gore, it's the sensory horror. Unlike other games where you just have to watch for monsters, here you have to monitor your character's heart rate, bleeding, and adrenaline. If your heart rate gets too high from a jump scare, you can literally die of shock. The game is so unsettling because it turns paranoia into a mechanic. You use a horror monitor to tag suspicious objects that might be traps, like a blood-spraying floor or a falling light fixture. This creates a constant draining tension where you're terrified to even walk across a room. Combined with its uncanny low-budget voice acting and surreal neon-drenched visuals, Illbleed feels deeply off. It's a game that treats human life like a cheap prop in a carnival game, making for an experience that is as hilarious as it is genuinely repulsive. Layer 4. Paranoia Escape. Released in 1998 for the PlayStation 1, Paranoia Escape is less of a game and more of a playable nightmare. Developed by Radical Party and influenced heavily by the surrealist vision of Japanese artist Screaming Mad George, it's a first-person pinball action hybrid. You control a rolling brain. Yes, a brain. Navigating through a world constructed entirely of distorted biological matter, bone, and twitching muscle. It never left Japan, which only adds to its mystique as one of the most bizarre artifacts in gaming history. What makes Paranoia Escape get under your skin is the constant sensory assault. The living architecture. The world isn't just made of bricks or mortar, it's made of breathing walls, teeth and muscle. It's pure body horror where the environment feels alive and hungry. Forget catchy tunes. The soundtrack is a messy mix of wet squelches, industrial grinding, and distant screams. It's designed to keep you in a state of constant anxiety. The hardware limitations make it scarier. Pixelated, jittery textures make the fleshy world look even more distorted and gross than high-definition graphics ever could. There's no logic, no safety. There are no NPCs to help you and no safe zones. It's just a frantic, claustrophobic race through a dimension that feels like it's actively digesting you. Now here's a fact for you. Screaming Mad George, the creative lead, is the same special effects artist behind Nightmare on Elm Street 4. Darkwood. Darkwood is a survival horror game developed by the Polish indie studio Acid Wizard Studio and released in 2017. Instead of using a traditional first or third person camera, the game is played from a top-down perspective, which makes its horror feel more cynical and unsettling rather than cinematic. The game takes place in a mysterious forest somewhere in Eastern Europe, where a strange force has cut the area off from the outside world. You play as a silent, nameless protagonist trying to survive, explore, and uncover the truth behind the woods. What makes Darkwood so disturbing is how it builds fear through uncertainty and tension rather than jump scares. During the day, you scavenge abandoned buildings and encounter disturbing characters. At night, you're forced to barricade yourself inside while unseen creatures roam outside, using sound and subtle visual cues to let you know something is very wrong. The game's atmosphere is oppressive and grim, filled with grotesque body horror, cryptic storytelling, and morally uncomfortable choices. Nothing is fully explained, but the world feels hostile, diseased, and alive. Darkwood doesn't try to scare you suddenly. It slowly erodes your sense of safety, making you fear the dark, the silence, and the things you can't see. Paratopic. Paratopic is a short experimental horror game developed by Arbitrary Metric and released in 2018. Inspired by low poly visuals and the aesthetic of early 3D games, Paratopic uses a purposely rough, VHS-like presentation to tell its story. The game follows multiple unnamed characters connected by a mysterious and illegal VHS tape. Rather than presenting a clear narrative, the story unfolds through fragmented scenes, abrupt perspective shifts, and unexplained events, leaving players to piece together what's actually happening. What makes Paratopic so disturbing is how disorienting it feels. Scenes suddenly cut without warning, time jumps feel unnatural, and the game often refuses to explain basic details. Conversations are awkward and tense, filled with long silences that make even ordinary interactions feel threatening. The low-fidelity visuals and distorted sound design create a sense of detachment, as if you're watching something you're not supposed to see. Violence appears suddenly and without build-up, making it feel shocking rather than dramatic. Paratopic doesn't rely on monsters or jump scares. Instead, it creates horror through confusion, paranoia, and the feeling that you're trapped inside a broken, unstable reality. Anatomy. Anatomy is a short experimental horror game created by indie developer Kitty Horror Show and released in 2016. It's less of a traditional game and more of an interactive horror experience focused entirely on atmosphere, symbolism, and psychological dread. The game takes place inside an empty, ordinary house. As you explore, you find cassette tapes that begin describing the structure of the house, its walls, hallways, and rooms, as if they were parts of a human body. Over time, these descriptions become more unsettling, suggesting that the house itself is alive, decaying, and aware. What makes Anatomy so disturbing is how quietly it gets under your skin. There are no monsters, no combat, and almost no direct threats. Instead, the horror comes from implication, the idea that familiar, safe spaces, like a home, can become something hostile and wrong. The sound design plays a huge role, using distant noises, droning ambience, and silence to create constant unease. As the tapes continue, the game's themes shift towards isolation, grief, and emotional decay. Anatomy doesn't try to scare you with sudden shocks. It slowly frames your idea of home into something unsettling, and that subtle psychological horror is what makes it so deeply disturbing. Hell Night. Hell Night, also known as Dark Messiah in some regions, is a survival horror game developed by Atlas and released in 1998 for PlayStation. Unlike most horror games of its era, Hell Night removes combat and almost entirely focuses purely on survival and fear. The game takes place in an underground tunnel system beneath Tokyo, where a mysterious creature has begun hunting anyone trapped below the sea. You play as a lone survivor, trying to escape the maze-like tunnels while being relentlessly pursued. What makes Hell Night so disturbing is its constant sense of panic. You can't fight the creature, you can only run, hide, and listen. The monster stalks you through dark corridors, reacting to sound and movement, meaning even small mistakes can get you killed. The first-person perspective makes everything feel claustrophobic and personal. Narrow hallways, flickering lights, and sudden noises keep you on edge, while the creatures and human screams echo through the tunnels, letting you know it's always close. There are no safe moments, no power fantasy, just the feeling of being haunted. Hell Night is disturbing because it strips horror down to its rawest form: helplessness, isolation, and the constant fear that something is right behind you. Michigan, Report from Hell. Michigan, Report from Hell, known as Michigan in Japan, is a survival horror game developed by Grasshopper Manufacture and released in 2004 for the PlayStation 2. The game was directed by Goichi Suda, who's known for making deliberately uncomfortable and unconventional games. The story takes place in the small American town of Michigan, where a mysterious outbreak turns residents into violent, grotesque creatures. Instead of directly fighting, you play as a cameraman embedded with a news crew, documenting the chaos as it unfolds. What makes Michigan Report from Hell so disturbing is its perspective. You're not the hero, you're an observer. The game constantly encourages you to film suffering, panic, and death, rewarding you for capturing shocking footage rather than stopping it. The tone is intentionally exploitative, bending horror with dark satire. Characters often feel disposable, and the game leans into the uncomfortable idea of media profiting from tragedy. Combined with awkward controls, sudden violence, and grotesque imagery, the experience feels disorienting and morally unsettling. Nanashi no Game. Nanashi no Game, which roughly translates to the Nameless Game, is a Japanese survival horror game developed by Square Enix and released in 2008 for the Nintendo DS. The game was directed by Takashi Tokita and is loosely inspired by Japanese urban legends and cursed media stories. The game centers around a mysterious video game cartridge, that is said to kill anyone who plays it after 7 days. You play as a college student, investigating the deaths linked to this cursed game, exploring abandoned buildings, subway tunnels, and eerie city locations to uncover the truth. What makes an Nashi no game so disturbing is how it uses simplicity to its advantage. The visuals are intentionally minimal and low detail, which leaves a lot up to the imagination. Environments feel empty, quiet, and wrong, with stretches of silence broken by sudden, unsettling sounds. The game also blurs the line between the cursed game inside the story and the game you're actually playing, creating a meta-horror effect. Characters talk directly about games causing harm, making the player feel complicit just for continuing. Instead of relying on constant scares, the Nashi no game builds dread through isolation, repetition, and the fear of engaging with something you're told is dangerous. Nocturne. Nocturne is a survival horror game developed by Terminal Reality and released in 1999 for PC. Unlike many horror games of its era, Nocturne leaned heavily into Lovecraftian horror, occult themes, and graphic violence, pushing boundaries well beyond what was common at the time. You play as a mysterious investigator known only as the Stranger, working for a secret organization that deals with supernatural threats. Each chapter drops you into a different case, involving witches, cults, haunted mansions, undead soldiers, or ancient cosmic entities. What makes Nocturne so disturbing is its tone. The game is relentlessly bleak, with grotesque enemy designs, graphic death animations, and environments soaked in decay and dread. Monsters don't just attack, they mutilate, stalk, and overwhelm you in tight, oppressive spaces. The sound design adds to the unease, using distorted audio, sudden screams, and long stretches of silence that keep you constantly on edge. The camera angles and clunky combat also make the encounters feel chaotic and uncomfortable, rather than empowering. There's no sense of heroism here, just survival in a world full of things humanity was never meant to uncover. Chiller. Chiller is a controversial arcade-like gun game released in 1986 by Exidy. Unlike typical arcade shooters where you fight enemies, Chiller puts you in the role of an unseen tormentor inside a medieval torture dungeon. There's no story, no protagonist, and no real objective beyond causing pain. Each level is filled with helpless victims chained to walls, stretched from racks, or trapped in Iron Maidens. Your goal is to shoot them and the environment to trigger increasingly graphic torture animations. What makes Chiller so disturbing is its complete lack of context or justification. You're not stopping villains or escaping danger, you're inflicting suffering for points. Limbs are torn apart, bodies are mutilated, and the game rewards precision with more explicit violence. The visuals are crude by today's standards, but that almost makes it worse. The exaggerated screams, bright blood, and exaggerated animations give the game a cruel, sadistic tone that feels shocking even decades later. Because of its extreme content, Chiller was heavily criticised and banned or removed from arcades in several regions. Chiller isn't disturbing because it's scary. It's disturbing because it turns torture into a game, stripping violence of meaning and turning it into a pure spectacle. Dujana. Excuse my pronunciation, because I know I probably butchered it. Dujana is a very obscure, little documented horror game that circulated online in the late 1990s and early 2000s, mostly through underground PC game communities. It never had a wide commercial release, which adds to its mystery and cult reputation. Information about its developers and original intent is scarce, and much of its history comes from player accounts rather than official sources. The game places the player inside a bleak, abstract environment with minimal explanation. There's no clear story, no tutorial, and almost no text. You're simply dropped into strange locations, empty rooms, dark corridors, and unnatural spaces, and left to wander. What makes Dujana so disturbing is its overwhelming sense of unease. There are a few obvious threats, but the game constantly makes you feel like something is wrong. Environments feel hostile and unfinished, sounds are distorted or unsettlingly quiet, and visual elements often appear broken or corrupted. The lack of clear goals or feedback creates a feeling of isolation and paranoia. You're never sure if you're progressing, being watched, or even playing the game correctly. Rather than scaring you with monsters or violence, Dujana unsettles you through confusion, emptiness, and the fear of being entrapped inside something you don't understand. Cruelty Squad. Cruelty Squad is a first-person shooter released in 2021 by indie developer Consumer Soft Products. On the surface, it looks like a chaotic, low-budget shooter, but that ugly, abrasive presentation is completely intentional. You play as a disposable mercenary, working for a nightmarish corporate regime, sent on assassinations in surreal, decaying environments. The game mixes stealth, platforming, and shooter mechanics, but it deliberately rejects polish, clarity, and comfort. What makes Cruelty Squad so disturbing is how aggressively hostile it feels. The visuals are harsh and disorienting, filled with clashing colours, distorted textures, and grotesque body horror. The UI is overwhelming, the sound design is abrasive, and nothing feels safe or stable. The game's themes are equally unsettling. It presents a world obsessed with profit, exploitation, and dehumanization. Life is cheap and morality barely exists. Even death feels meaningless, just another system for people to exploit. Instead of scaring you with monsters or darkness, Cruelty Squad overwhelms you psychologically. It feels like being trapped inside a corrupted operating system that hates you for existing. That constant sensory assault combined with its bleak worldview is what makes Cruelty Squad so disturbing. Layer 5. The Cat Lady.
What's the matter, sleepyhead? Had a bad dream? Do you want me to give you a cuddle and a kiss? Take the nightmares away?
The Cat Lady is a psychological horror game developed by Harvester Games and released in 2012. It's the first entry in what later became known as the Devil Came Through Here trilogy. The game follows a lonely, middle-aged woman named Susan Ashworth, who struggles with severe depression and suicidal thoughts. After a failed suicide attempt, she finds herself trapped between life and death, forced to confront a group of supernatural figures known as the Parasites. What makes the Cat Lady so disturbing isn't just its imagery, it's its themes. The game openly tackles topics like mental illness, self-harm, abuse, and existential despair. Its visuals are grim and surreal, often showing graphic violence and disturbing symbolism that reflects Susan's mental state. The horror feels deeply personal. Instead of monsters chasing you, the game confronts you with emotional suffering, hopelessness, and the fear of being completely alone. The sound design and bleak environments reinforce a constant sense of dread and sadness, rather than adrenaline-driven fear. The Cat Lady isn't disturbing because it wants to shock you. It's disturbing because it forces you to sit with pain, trauma, and uncomfortable truths that most games avoid. Boppin'. I'm at a stage now where these entries are getting more obscure and harder to find. This one took a lot of looking to find the game and what it meant by boppin' uncensored. I did a huge amount of investigating and I found out why this game was disturbing. Boppin' is a puzzle video game created by Jennifer Diane Retz in 1991. The game seems very innocent and child-friendly, but was controversial for its death animations. When you run out of lives in the game, the main character you play as commits suicide. Here's the clip. Yeah, pretty disturbing. This one was very hard to find, and it will only get more difficult from here. Devotion. Devotion is a psychological horror game developed by Taiwanese studio Red Candle Games and released in 2019. Unlike traditional horror games, Devotion takes place almost entirely inside a family apartment, slowly revealing a story as you explore the same space across different points in time. You play as a man named Du Feng Yu, an aspiring screenwriter living with his wife and young daughter. As the apartment changes, you uncover fragments of their lives, missed dreams, strained relationships, and a growing obsession with faith and spiritual healing. What makes Devotion so disturbing is how grounded it feels. There are no monsters chasing you, no combat, and very few overt scares. Instead, the horror comes from watching an ordinary family fall apart. The game explores themes of religious extremism, parental pressure, emotional abuse, and guilt. Small details, children's drawings, distorted prayers, unsettling music, gradually reveal how love turns into control and how good intentions can lead to irreversible harm. Because everything feels realistic and intimate, the story hits harder than traditional horror. You're not afraid of something supernatural, you're afraid of what people can do to each other. That quiet, emotional devastation is what makes Devotion so deeply disturbing. Mogiko Castle. Mogiko Castle is a Japanese indie horror game released in 2012 and created by the developer known as Deep Sea Prisoner, also known as Mogiko. Like many indie horror titles of the time, it was made using RPG Maker and relies heavily on storytelling rather than complex gameplay. The game follows a schoolgirl named Yunika Kurai who suddenly finds herself trapped inside a strange otherworldly castle. The place is inhabited by creatures called Mogikos, small cartoonish beings who act friendly at first but quickly reveal much darker intentions. What makes Mogiko Castle so disturbing is its extreme tonal shift. The game uses cute pixel art, humour and exaggerated characters to lower your guard, then confronts you with graphic violence, sexual threats, abuse and psychological horror. The contrast between its playful presentation and its brutal subject matter makes everything feel deeply uncomfortable. Scenes can change suddenly from jokes to disturbing imagery, giving players no time to emotionally prepare. Mogiko Castle isn't just scary, it's intentionally unsettling, using shock, taboo topics, and emotional manipulation to leave a lasting impact. Downfall. Downfall is a psychological horror adventure game, originally released in 2009, later receiving a remake in 2016. It's developed under the studio Harvester Games, known for emotionally heavy horror titles. The story follows a troubled man named Joe Davis who checks into a strange hotel with his wife in hopes of fixing their broken marriage. As the night progresses, reality begins to fracture and Joe is forced to confront disturbing visions, violent impulses, and fragments of his own guilt. What makes Downfall so disturbing isn't just the violence, it's the psychology behind it. The game dives into themes of depression, obsession, grief, and self-destruction. Many of the horrors you encounter feel like manifestations of Joe's inner turmoil rather than external threats. The visuals are bleak and grotesque, the sound design is oppressive, and the dialogue is often uncomfortable and raw. Instead of relying on constant scares, the game creates dread by slowly revealing how broken its protagonist truly is. Downfall is disturbing because it doesn't let you distance yourself from the horror. It traps you inside a collapsing mind, and that emotional descent is what makes it so unsettling. Party Hard. Party Hard is an indie stealth game published by TinyBuild, released in 2015. The game uses a colourful top-down pixel art style that almost feels playful at first glance. You play as a quiet, unnamed man who's been pushed to his breaking point by loud neighbours throwing non-stop parties. Instead of calling the police, he takes matters into his own hands, systematically eliminating partygoers while avoiding detection. What makes Party Hard disturbing is the contrast between its presentation and subject matter. The game looks cheerful and cartoonish, but it's entirely built around planning and committing murders. You're encouraged to observe routines, set traps, and clean up bodies while upbeat music continues to play. There's also a darkly satirical tone running through the game. That emotional detachment makes everything feel so unsettling. As the story progresses, it becomes clear that this isn't just about noise complaints. It's about obsession, loss of control, and a descent into madness. Party Hard isn't disturbing because it's graphic. It's disturbing because it disguises violence as something casual, routine, and disturbingly fun. Revenge of the Sunfish. Revenge of the Sunfish is a short experimental indie horror game created by Aaron Oldenburg and released in the early 2010s. It's not a traditional horror game with clear objectives or mechanics. Instead, it's more of an interactive art piece built around discomfort and confusion. The game places you in a strange, abstract environment filled with crude drawings, distorted visuals, and unsettling text. There's very little explanation of what's happening or why you're there. You simply move through the space while the game throws disturbing imagery and fragmented thoughts at you. What makes Revenge of the Sunfish so disturbing is how raw and unfiltered it feels. The visuals look intentionally amateurish and unstable, and something pulled straight from a nightmare or a corrupt sketchbook. The audio is harsh and disorienting, and the game often breaks basic rules of structure and logic. Rather than trying to scare you with monsters or jump scares, it creates unease through meaninglessness, repetition, and emotional chaos. It feels personal, almost invasive, like you're experiencing someone else's intrusive thoughts. Revenge of the Sunfish is disturbing because it doesn't try to entertain or comfort you. It traps you inside something ugly, confusing, and deeply uncomfortable, and leaves you there. Exploding Lips. Exploding Lips is a bizarre cult-era PC shooter developed and published by Galaxy Games and originally released around 1999 for Windows. Instead of traditional enemies, the game pits the player against strange giant floating lips and other surreal targets that invade ordinary environments, forcing you to survive through fast-paced shooting action. On paper it sounds quirky or even absurd, but what makes Exploding Lips disturbing isn't so much its gameplay as its unsettling imagery and tone. The grotesque concept of lips as hostile creatures gives a bizarre, uncanny quality to the violence. Instead of monsters that feel rooted in horror traditions, it throws exaggerated, almost biomorphic forms at you that defy normal logic. Though the game's visuals are low resolution by today's standards, they often come off as uncanny and uncomfortable, especially when combined with erratic sound effects and sudden explosions when enemies are hit. Exploding Lips is disturbing not because it relies on jump scares or gore, but because it turns something familiar into something aggressively hostile, leaving players with a strange sense of discomfort rather than clearly defined fear. Layer 6. Mastaba Snoopy. Mastaba Snoopy is a surreal horror interactive fiction game created in 2012 using the Twine engine by an anonymous developer. Its story is wildly abstract and unlike most mainstream games you've seen before. There's been almost no information I can find about this anywhere online. In the game's world, an alien intelligence discovers a forgotten book of Peanuts comics and misinterprets it as a guide to life and the universe. Over time, this entity absorbs all existence and reshapes everything, including characters resembling Snoopy, Woodstock, and the rest of the gang. Supposedly, Mastaba Snoopy is a nightmare version of childhood. I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, unquote. I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream is a psychological horror adventure game released in 1995, developed by the Dreamers Guild and published by Cyber Dreams. It was written with input from the original author, Harlan Ellison, based on his acclaimed short story of the same name. The game places you in a post-apocalyptic future where a supercomputer named Am has destroyed humanity, except for 5 survivors whom Am keeps alive and tortures endlessly for his own sadistic amusement. Each character must confront nightmarish scenarios tailored to each of their deepest fears and regrets. What makes I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream so disturbing isn't just the horror imagery. It's how it forces you to explore the psychology of suffering. You're not fighting monsters, you're navigating each character's emotional torment, making choices that directly affect their fate and suffering. The themes are heavy: guilt, abuse, identity, and the loss of agency. Am itself isn't just hostile, it's cruel and omnipotent. It mocks you, rewrites reality around you, and uses your own fears against you. The result is an experience that can feel intimate, bleak, and emotionally devastating. Now for why it's on the iceberg. It's labelled as I Have No Mouth and Must Scream Uncut. The uncut part is an alleged early build that included even darker content and endings that were never officially released. While no official uncut version has ever been confirmed, the idea contributes to the game's mystique and reputation as something even more unsettling than what players originally experienced. I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream isn't scary because of monsters or jump scares. It's disturbing because it confronts you with what it means to suffer with no hope of escape. Demonophobia. Demonophobia is a Guro survival horror game with more emphasis on the horror aspect and much less on the survival part. You play as a girl named Sakuri Kunikai, who after jokingly pretending to summon a demon to get revenge for some reason, wakes up to find herself dumped in hell. Not surprisingly, hell is full of death traps and demons that only desire to cause grievous bodily harm, including a large hulking thing that looks like a distant relative of a certain geometry-based monster that is constantly hunting her down. And she's pretty much powerless, but she seems to have help from a small mysterious demon in blue who offers her advice and gives her a chance to flee. The game features lots of death traps with long, elaborate cutscenes that come suddenly just by taking a wrong turn, finishing Sakuri off in brutal ways, who being conscious the whole time, will revive a few days later and try to again from the beginning level of hell and a healthy dose of amnesia. Garage, Bad Dream Adventure. Garage, Bad Dream Adventure is a surreal psychological horror game created by Japanese developer Kinoko Poroko and released in 1999 for Windows. The game blends adventure, exploration, and symbolic storytelling in a way few games ever have, making it more like an interactive nightmare than a traditional horror title. In Bad Dream Adventure, you play as a faceless, humanoid character trapped inside a strange, industrial world filled with rusted machinery, labyrinth corridors, and bizarre creatures. There's no clear plot or objectives, you simply wander, observe, and try to make sense of a place that feels both dreamlike and deeply wrong. What makes Garage, Bad Dream Adventure so disturbing isn't cheap scares or sudden enemies, it's the atmosphere and symbolism. Everything about the game feels uncanny. Environments look familiar yet warped, NPCs are unsettling in both design and behaviour, and objects often defy logic or expectation. The world feels deserted and decaying, yet it hints at history you never fully understand. The sound design reinforces that unease. Ambient drones, distant clangs, and the eerie silence creates a feeling of isolation and dread. The game's visuals walk a fine line between grotesque and abstract, making you feel like you're observing something you're not meant to comprehend. Instead of telling a story, Bad Dream Adventure drops you into one, and slowly reveals how wrong the world really is. It's disturbing because it messes with your mind, not just your senses. Dreamweb. Dreamweb is a cyberpunk adventure game developed by Creative Reality and released in 1994 for PC and later on other platforms. The game blends gritty dystopian future with dark psychological themes, making it one of the first adventure titles to lean genuinely into mature and unsettling subject matter. You play as Ryan, a tortured anti-hero living in bleak metropolis, ruled by corrupt corporations, crime and decay. After surviving a supernatural event called the Dreamweb, Ryan is chosen to eliminate 7 individuals he believes are responsible for the world's suffering. What starts as a mission quickly turns into a spiral of moral ambiguity, paranoia and self-destruction. What makes Dreamweb so disturbing isn't just the violence, it's how personal and bleak the story feels. Unlike many games of its era, it doesn't hide the psychological toll of its narrative. Ryan's world is empty, oppressive, and filled with morally grey choices. NPCs don't feel safe or comforting, they feel trapped and broken, just like the city they live in. The game refuses to shy away from uncomfortable subject matter: murder, addiction, insanity, and the slow erosion of hope. Its pixelated visuals and eerie soundtrack only add to the sense of isolation and dread, reminding players that in this world, there is no real justice, only survival. Dreamweb is disturbing because it feels less like escapism and more like a descent into despair, forcing you to confront the darkness of both the world and the character you control. That emotional weight is what lingers so long after the game ends. There's some games on this iceberg that just have no real correlation, no information, and just end up being a bit of a brick wall, to be honest. So I'm going to quickly rapid fire through those now. RSD Game Maker. It's just a game engine that made some partially lost video games. That's all. Maybe it's referring to games it's made, but I can't find anything on it. Myriad. As this Reddit user said, I have no idea what it's referring to. Google didn't bring up any useful results. I looked as well. I couldn't find anything on it. No gameplay or even any proof of it existing. Polybius. The background gameplay is just a concept. Polybius is an urban legend about a mysterious arcade game. According to legend, the game appeared in arcades around Portland, Oregon in 1981. The gameplay was supposedly psychoactive, abstract, and dangerous. Children who played the arcade game were said to suffer from amnesia, seizures, night terrors, and hallucinations. Despite the adverse effects, the arcade cabinet was described as so addictive players returned to Polybius repeatedly until they went insane, died, or vanished. The lack of any surviving Polybius cabinets is explained in Men in Black, who were said to record data on the players before removing the arcade machines. Despite all the drama, there is no evidence of any Polybius machines existing in the 1980s. Agartha. The gameplay is from a partially found build. Agartha is an unreleased game for the Sega Dreamcast. Commissioned and funded by Sega, development was started by French developer No Cliché, which was acquired by Sega in 1997. Here's a direct quote from the game. During the winter of 1929, in a Romanian village that was partially destroyed by a landslide that occurred during a mysterious earthquake, a subterranean city exists, called Agartha. This is where evil is being kept prisoner and is desperate to escape. Kirk, the human hero, will encounter a series of characters from villages: the living dead, fanatics from an evil sect, monsters, demons, soldier monks, priests, archangels, and the Sentinel, who is the ultimate personification of evil. As Kirk, you can decide to save as many innocent people as possible or trigger the arrival of chaos on Earth. As Kirk's morals waver between good and evil, this ambiguity changes the aims of the adventure and the narration of the story. From the plot synopsis, it can be derived that the player would have to make moral choices, bringing the game's narration to different conclusions. The role, emphasis, and implementation of combat is unclear, but an online capability was mentioned, featuring death matches or team play matches. Dog Day. Dog Day is a surreal psychological horror adventure game released in 1997 for PC, developed by the independent studio Aspect Productions. At a glance, it looks like a simple first-person exploration game, but it quickly reveals itself to be something much stranger and more unsettling. In Dog Day, you play as an unnamed character wandering through a fragmented world filled with abandoned streets, eerie buildings, and bizarre locations that never quite make logical sense. There's no clear story or objective. Instead, the game drops you into an atmosphere that feels both familiar and fundamentally wrong. What makes Dog Day so disturbing isn't jump scares or monsters, but the way it messes with your sense of reality and meaning. The visuals are deliberately low resolution and glitchy, with odd textures and warped objects that seem almost subconscious. Environments warp unexpectedly and the scenes repeat or change without warning, creating a feeling of being caught in a loop or bad dream. Sound plays a big role too. Ambient noise, distant voices, and sudden audio distortion make it hard to know when something is actually happening, versus when your own expectations are being manipulated. You never feel truly safe or grounded, even in otherwise quiet rooms. Instead of telling you a story, Dog Day makes you feel a story, one built in confusion, emptiness, and disorientation. And that psychological unease is what exactly makes it so unsettling. Masochissia. Masochissia is an experimental psychological horror game developed by indie creator Target. Originally released in the mid-2000s as a free online experience, it's become a cult classic among fans. Unlike traditional horror games with clear goals or mechanics, Masochissia drops you into a dreamlike world full of strange, abstract environments and disjointed visuals. There's no tutorial, no explanation, and almost no sense of structure. Just you and a series of scenes that feel eerie, warped, and wrong. What makes Masochissia so disturbing isn't sudden scares or jump moments, it's the psychological discomfort it creates. The game often uses unsettling imagery that goes just beyond comprehension. Distorted figures, dead-end hallways that don't make sense, and objects placed in ways that feel off, even if you can't quite say why. Masochissia doesn't explain itself. It doesn't reassure you, it simply puts you in an environment that feels hostile to logic, narrative, and comfort. And that is the full disturbing video game Iceberg. Surprised you're still here, to be honest. It was a long one. Thank you for watching. I really hope you enjoyed it. Again, I want to say apologies for the first tier. The quality was not great. You could see how much it improved over the series. That's it. Thanks a million for all the support during the series, and we'll see what we move on to next. Alright, goodbye.